Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and I'm going to continue what I started on Tuesday, that is catching up with things that a long time ago academics changed their minds about or resolved or whatever, and the general public haven't caught up. Well, there's a lot of things I could discuss, and I could go on for a very long time, but I'm going to cut it a little bit short, and I'm going to move into my wheelhouse, which is biblical studies. And I'm going to talk about three things that happened in the what we call the Hebrew Bible, what used to be called the Old Testament. And then I'm going to finish with Einstein. So let's get started. Now, I took degrees in theology from Oxford University back in the early 1970s, beginning in 1970. And there were certain things that were pretty much up for grabs at that time, but there were some things that were fairly stable and pretty well everyone thought they were good to go with. And things have changed. So I'm going to start with the Exodus. Now, if you remember your book of Genesis, you will recall that Abraham went down into Canaan and he had a son there, and then his son had a son, or had two sons. That is, Abraham gave birth to his wife gave birth to Isaac, and then Isaac had twins, Esau and Jacob, and Esau was a wild man who did everything wrong, and the younger twin, Jacob, did everything right. And among other things, he got his name changed from Jacob to Israel, or Israel, and had 12 sons, and those sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. And at the time there were only 11 sons when Joseph was born to Rachel, who had not had any sons up until that point, and he was the favored son, even though he was the younger son, because he was the son of Rachel, who Jacob preferred to her elder son, sister Leah, who gave birth to all kinds of other, Reuben and whatnot. And the older sons were jealous, and so they sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt, and eventually, after a lot of ups and downs, he became a very powerful person in Egypt. And so when there was a famine in Canaan, the brothers and Jacob went down into Egypt, where Joseph could help them with food and clothing and money and so forth. But then times changed, and the Israelites became slaves. And they were slaves for a very long time, until eventually a new leader arose, Moses. And Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt by basically bullying the Pharaoh into letting the people go. And then they wandered for 40 years in the desert, and finally went back into Canaan and conquered it. Okay, well, that's the That's the underlying story, and is of course foundational for Judaism. Well, back in the 1970s, there are a lot of questions about the Exodus, and the general consensus among scholars, which was quite a surprise to me, because I was, I was pretty doctrinaire, like Bible believer, so I'd heard about Jacob and the Israelites and the Exodus and so forth, and it all seemed perfectly rational to me. But even in 1970, when I wrote my first essay on Moses, the general consensus among scholars was that the Exodus didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the Israelites were never slaves in Egypt. And the reason that scholars make that argument is twofold. Number one, there are absolutely no records of anybody remotely like the 12 tribes of Israel being in Egypt at any time. You can make some really, really stretchy arguments that there were people, I think they're called the Habiru, and some people say, well, that could be Hebrew, and that might have been them, but they weren't really slaves, and they weren't from Canaan, and they didn't and they didn't disappear under a mighty leader. There are no records of the Israelites being in Egypt, and there's no archaeological evidence that they were ever there. Whether or not they crossed the desert to get over into Sinai and then up into the area that became Israel, there's no archaeological evidence of that either. But that's not greatly surprising, because you don't get a lot of artifacts surviving in the desert one way or another. But archaeology and literary evidence outside the Bible does not support any notion of an Exodus. None. And I remember writing an essay about this, and I was kind of befuddled at the time, and I was thinking, well, why is it in the Bible? And that's a very good question, and a question that I'll come back to in a minute. Why do people create histories that there's no evidence for? And my simple answer is that history is never about the past. It's always about the present. And so you write your history and rewrite it to validate how you are today. And if things change today, then you rewrite history. And we're still doing it. People are still rewriting history right up to today in different ways. All right, well, so that's what. So the Exodus, at least as far as biblical scholars are concerned, as far as I'm concerned, never happened. Well, what about the next step? They get all their laws and everything, and Moses does all this good stuff, and then dies, and Joshua takes over, and he leads the people over the Jordan into the promised land and conquers everywhere. Conquers Jericho, for example, is a famous hymn about that, and people remember, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Well, the professor of archaeology at Oxford when I was there was a woman called Kathleen Kenyon, and she was just about to retire. In fact, she gave up her position as the head of the Women's College St. Hilda's in 1973 when I took my final exams. But I studied under her a little bit, and I also read two of her books, one of them being Digging Up Jericho. She spent most of the 50s digging up the site of Jericho. And what did she discover? Well, she discovered lots of places where the walls had come tumbling down. There are places where they had been burned. There are all kinds of destruction layers. But not when Joshua was around. Like the walls came tumbling down all the time because the city of Jericho was being attacked all the time. But when Joshua supposedly was conquering Canaan, or the Promised Land, Jericho wasn't inhabited, nor were other towns. There was one called Ai, and the book of Joshua says that Joshua conquered Ai too. Well, Ai had not been inhabited for 1,000 years by the time that Joshua came around. In fact, its very name means ruins. It was a place that was lying in ruins even in Joshua's day. So biblical scholars now believe that the so-called conquest of Canaan, the Promised Land, never happened. That it was something else. They can't agree on what else. Like, one of the arguments is that the Israelite people emerged from a common Semitic stock that was inhabiting the area in general, and that they split off from other groups and developed their own nations over time. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that they were migratory, what we call pastoralists, that is, people who herd sheep and goats and camels and whatnot. And they were sort of wandering around Mesopotamia in general, and eventually came into the area of Canaan and settled alongside Canaanites and eventually replaced them. There are a lot of different replacement theories, and archaeologists are not in general agreement, but they are in agreement that there wasn't any person called Joshua, and he didn't lead armies into the Promised Land and conquered it. It just didn't happen. Right? Number two. Number three, and this one is interesting because the fact that the Exodus didn't happen, the fact that the conquest didn't happen, were both pretty current theories right around the time when I was beginning my theological studies. But in my first year, for my first preliminary exams, I had to study what was called the succession narrative. And the succession narrative is mostly in the latter part of the books of Samuel and the earlier parts of First Kings. And it's a succession from Saul to David to Solomon. And the way it works, after the book of Joshua, you have the book of Judges. And the book of Judges says that for a very long time, the 12 tribes of Israel lived side by side and pretty much didn't coalesce as nations or as armies unless they had to defend themselves against the Philistines or against the Moabites or against the Edomites. And a person would be essentially brought forward by God, people like Gideon, for example, who would not necessarily want to be leaders, but they became leaders. They were pushed into the leader position, and the word that was used in English is that they became judges, but they weren't really judging in the legal sense. They were judging the nations, bringing them together. So the tribes would all come together under the leader, like Gideon. They defeat their enemy, and then they go back to being separate. And that the argument in the book of Judges is that God didn't want a unified nation, didn't want a capital, didn't want any of that stuff, wanted the 12 tribes to be independent. Well, then Saul is anointed by Samuel to be not just a judge, but to be a king, and to remain a king after the wars with the Philistines were over. But he doesn't last for one reason or another, and that David takes over. And David and Saul were at one time like good buddies, and then they fell out, and Saul kept trying to kill him, and in the end Saul died. And his son became king for a little while, but ultimately David took over. And David conquered the city of Jerusalem from the inhabitants, who were called Jebusites, and made it his capital, and brought the Ark of the Covenant up into the city, and supposedly danced in front of it as he was bringing it up. But God said, I don't want a house. Don't build me a temple. Don't do anything except leave my ark, my presence in a tent. I like tents. I'm a pastoralist. I like to move around. So David didn't build a temple, but he did make Jerusalem the capital of the united monarchy of Israel and Judah. And then his son Solomon succeeded him. Now, the succession narrative is complicated because Solomon was actually the youngest of the sons of David. And the succession narrative has to do with the question of how did the youngest son get to inherit, when the basic pattern is that the eldest son inherits. Well, as you can also remember from the story of Jacob and his 12 sons, the people we call the patriarchs tend to be the youngest sons, or the younger sons. Like there's Esau and Jacob. Right? Jacob was younger than Esau, but he inherits. Joseph, until the 12th son, Benjamin, comes along, is the youngest, and he's the favored one. Well, now we've got David, who's got a number of sons, including Absalom and Adonijah and so forth. And yet Solomon, who's the youngest of them all, is the one who inherits. And the succession narrative, which I studied in my first year, was all about how that happened. And back then, 1970, we all pretty much agreed that the events described in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings were accurate. That David was the king of two monarchies, Israel and Judah, and that Solomon was his son, and that Solomon was able to build a temple and also a palace, but the temple is the most important. And that temple survived from the time that Solomon built it until 586, when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar invaded and destroyed the temple and took off all the Judean elite into Babylon in a period called the Babylonian exile. Well, I was really enamored of the story of David and Solomon, and I just assumed that they were historically accurate. Well, now archaeologists who are doing a great deal of excavating in the general area that used to be Israel and Judah now argue that David and Solomon never existed. That at the time that they are supposedly kings of Israel and Judah, which is roughly around the 10th century BCE, Judah was virtually deserted. and we can't do a lot of archaeology in Jerusalem because the sites are either sacred, as in the case of the Temple Mount, where it would be interesting to see what's underneath what's there right now, but there's a very holy mosque there right now, and you're not going to get any permission to go digging under the mosque. And otherwise, you've got the city built on top of the old remains and so forth. But when you do surface studies and excavations in the hill country around Jerusalem, there is just no evidence that there was much of a population in the area at the time of David and Solomon, and certainly not enough to support the kind of taxation that would have been necessary in order to build a major temple and also a major palace complex. That the general belief among scholars these days is that David, who's the originator of the dynasty, that what's called the House of David, is made up. And that both Israel and Judah didn't come into their own until at least 2 centuries after the time of supposed kingships of David and Solomon, which, in later life was a real shock to me, because I my whole undergraduate career was based, well, not the whole career, but a lot of it was based on the idea that David and Solomon were real people, and archaeologists and biblical scholars just say, no, sorry, they just were made up. And who were they made up by? They were made up by priests around a little before the time when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah. Like, Israel got destroyed by the Assyrian Empire a century before this, in the 6th century BCE. And an awful lot of the Hebrew Bible is asking the question, how is it that Judah survived, that is the nation around Jerusalem, and Israel, there's a northern kingdom, got obliterated by the Assyrians. And the part that was obliterated are now known as the 10 lost tribes, because Assyria, just after they had destroyed Israel, just took the population, or the great bulk of the population, including the elite and the scholars and so forth, and they just redistributed them in other parts of the empire, and they just lost to history. And there's a lot of ideas about where they might be, but basically they were lost. And the southern kingdom of Judah around Jerusalem survived until 586, when Nebuchadnezzar came knocking on the door and ended up destroying the kingdom and destroying Solomon's temple and deporting the entire upper echelon of the Judean society. And just before that happened, in the reign of King Josiah, there are a group of priests that we now call the Deuteronomists, who constructed a history of Israel and Judah that basically said, if you support our God, and his name was Yahweh, or, well, we don't really know what it's called, but that's the best we can come up with. And if you follow Yahweh, you will prosper, and if you don't follow Yahweh, you will not prosper. So Israel went off in search of Asherah and Baal and all these other gods, and eventually Yahweh said, okay, I've had enough, I'm going to wipe you out. And Judah, if you don't toe the line, you're next. And so what happened was they got defeated by the Babylonians, and the prophets, including Jeremiah and Ezekiel, said, see, you didn't follow the rules, and so we're going to wipe you out too. But before all that happened, the priests had raised up Josiah as what we would now call a Messiah, an anointed one, a king. And they thought that he was going to usher in like a new age of glory and triumph, like David's. But they invented the King David as the archetype of what Josiah was going to be. Well, Josiah was a bit of a disappointment because he he ended up dying in battle, and then Nebuchadnezzar came along and wiped out the rest of Jerusalem. But that's the biblical history that I'm actually writing about right now. It's really fascinating how people use history for their own purposes, and makes us wonder about how current politicians, for example, rewrite history to suit their own political ends. Well, that's another story which I'll go into at another time. The last thing I want to talk about is Einstein's theory of time, which goes along with special relativity, which I talked about last time. But I didn't mention time, and I thought that, well, we should end with this. And I love this story. Einstein, back in the early 20th century, was a patent office clerk, and he was late to work one day. He was on a bus, I think it was, and he could see that the clock, which was near the patent office, was coming up to, let's say, 8 o'clock, I don't know what. And he had this thought experiment. If I can travel at the speed of light, I can reach the patent office just before 8 o'clock. Because that's what the clock's showing. If I travel at the speed of light, I will get to the clock right at the same time. And that's just an amazingly inventive thought experiment. But it led him to the set of equations that showed that the closer you get to the speed of light, the more your clock slows down relative to the world around you. Not yours. Your clock, your internal clock, always keeps going at the same speed. But what other people see of you is that your clock is getting slower and slower and slower the more you approach the speed of light. And that's just like counterintuitive. The idea that time varies depending on your speed relative to other things. But that's what the special theory of special theory of relativity basically says, is that in a certain sense, the speed of light is, well, there's a couple of things about the speed of light that are really weird, and one of them is it doesn't matter your speed. The speed of light coming towards you, no matter how fast you're traveling, is always the same. And that's another, as a corollary of the idea of time being relative. Like, time doesn't feel relative, although Einstein himself said that time goes fast or slow depending on what you're doing. If you're sitting next to a pretty woman, then time goes pretty fast, or something like that. Whatever. Try not to be misogynistic about it. But that's the psychological perception of time. What Einstein was saying is that the physical manifestation of time is relative, and we've proven that to be true by taking very accurate clocks onto spaceships and various other fast moving vehicles, and shown that if they travel fast enough, they slow down. And it's just, as I said, completely counterintuitive, but has been like definitively, as far as anything can be, definitively proven by modern physics. All right, well, that's it for Friday. Hope you have a joyous weekend. And if you like my videos, please subscribe. And I'll be back on Tuesday with something or other. I have no idea yet. I've got some ideas percolating, but nothing yet. So have a joyous weekend.